In the ancient world, stories often held more than mere words. They carried echoes of divine order, warnings etched in celestial memory, and mysteries that whispered of realms beyond sight. Among these stories, few are as haunting, as puzzling, and as veiled in shadow as the account of the Watchers. Those beings described not merely as angels, but as a particular host tasked with a sacred responsibility. Their presence emerges from the depths of ancient texts, not with fanfare or ceremony, but with quiet unease, as if their story was never meant to be fully revealed, only glimpsed by the attentive and pondered by the faithful. These Watchers were not human, but they walked among humanity. They were not gods, though their powers stirred awe and dread. They were not demons at first, yet their actions would darken the fabric of the world and shake the balance between heaven and earth. What makes their tale so compelling is not only the otherworldliness of their origin, but the deeply human failing they succumbed to, desire. It was not an external enemy, not an invading force, but a hunger from within that turned them from watchers to transgressors, from observers to offenders. The ancient Book of Enoch, among other writings, recounts how these celestial beings were sent to earth to guide, to oversee, and to preserve order. But what began as a divine mission took a turn that not only altered their own fate, but also reshaped the spiritual landscape of the world. The question remains, who were these beings that dared to defy heaven? What force could tempt angels to fall? And what truth lies hidden behind their mysterious descent? To understand the Watchers is to step into a realm where the sacred and the profane collide, where purity can be corrupted, and where choice becomes the dividing line between the holy and the fallen. This journey is not one of speculation, but of ancient witness. We turn to the writings preserved through generations, scriptures that whisper truths that many have tried to forget, and we ask what their story reveals not only about them, but about us. For there is something unsettlingly familiar about their fall. Their longing, their rebellion, their sorrow, all mirror the deep currents that flow through the human heart. This is not merely a tale of angels, but a testimony of the struggle between duty and desire, between the divine calling and the temptation to abandon it. In Psalm 1 verse 2, it is written that the one who delights in the law of the Lord is like a tree planted by streams of water. Yet what becomes of those who abandon that law? The Watchers, once rooted in the presence of the Almighty, chose instead to uproot themselves and pursue a different stream, one that promised passion but delivered judgment. This introduction begins a search for truth buried in sacred texts and forgotten wisdom, a search for understanding in a story that challenges our notions of righteousness, of justice, and of heavenly order. And perhaps most importantly, a search for the meaning this ancient fall holds for a world still grappling with the tension between the spiritual and the carnal. Their descent was not sudden, but a slow turning of the heart. Their rebellion was not born of hatred, but of longing. And in their downfall, we begin to glimpse the profound and perilous cost of disobedience, not just for angels, but for anyone entrusted with something sacred. They were not sent to rule, but to observe. Their mission was not conquest, but guardianship. When the Watchers descended from the heights of heaven, they did so under divine commission, bearing the weight of holy responsibility. Each one was chosen, not arbitrarily, but with purpose, entrusted to be a silent witness to the affairs of humanity, to ensure that the divine order was neither disturbed nor defiled. They were meant to be distant, yet vigilant, never interfering, never stepping beyond the bounds of their sacred charge. But the world they entered was not barren or lifeless. It teemed with beauty, with motion, with the wonder of human existence. The earth, in its untamed form, was a marvel to behold, and humanity, crafted in the image of God, was unlike anything the Watchers had known. There was something both fragile and radiant about mankind, something that stirred curiosity in the heart of these celestial sentinels. And what began as observation soon became fascination, and fascination opened the door to temptation. Before their fall, there was a moment of unity among them. According to the Book of Enoch, they gathered atop Mount Hermon, a place that would become infamous for what transpired there. It was not merely a location on the map, but a spiritual crossroads, a summit where divine command met the stirrings of rebellion. There, high above the earth, the Watchers made a pact. Bound by fear and desire, they swore an oath together, an unbreakable bond that declared their shared intent to step beyond the limits imposed by heaven. The solemnity of that vow cannot be overstated. These were not idle words whispered in secrecy. This was a collective declaration, an intentional and knowing rebellion against the divine. It was not an accident, nor a gradual drift. It was a moment of choice where loyalty was abandoned and desire enshrined. Their descent began not with action, but with agreement, a covenant of defiance made in full awareness of its weight. This moment marked the turning point. The Watchers, once known as loyal guardians, became rebels. And it is here that the tragedy truly unfolds, for they did not simply fall from grace, they walked away from it. They did not stumble blindly into error, but stepped deliberately into darkness. This choice altered their nature. The very ones meant to uphold divine order became agents of disorder. Those who were set apart for holiness became immersed in corruption. The transformation was not immediate, but its trajectory was irreversible. As they began to interact with humanity more closely, the lines between watcher and participant began to blur. The awe they once felt toward God shifted into admiration for human beauty. The clarity of purpose they once held became clouded by emotions they had never before entertained. And in this distortion, their heavenly assignment was forsaken. Scripture reminds us in Proverbs 4 verse 23 to guard the heart, for it is the wellspring of life. The Watchers, though not human, failed to do just that. They allowed a seed of desire to take root, and from it grew rebellion. They were entrusted with oversight, but instead sought ownership. They were given vision, but chose to follow their own will instead of the one who sent them. What makes their story so sobering is not only that they rebelled, but that they did so with clarity and unity. Their fall was not the result of deception, but of defiance. They did not rebel alone, but in concert with one another, sealing their fate through mutual encouragement in wrongdoing. Their unity, once a strength, became a snare. It reveals how even heavenly beings, when bound together by shared disobedience, can descend into ruin. The Watchers illustrate a profound truth, that position without obedience is empty, and that even those closest to the divine can choose to turn away. Their corruption began with a failure to remain in the posture of humility. In their minds, they could handle what they were never meant to possess. They could manage a closeness to mankind without compromise. But they were wrong. By taking that first step, by making that oath, they transformed from servants of heaven into rebels against it. Their wings may have remained, but their hearts had shifted. Their eyes may still have seen the heavens, but their gaze was now fixed on the earth. What was once holy purpose became self-centered desire, and in that moment, the guardians became the very threat they were sent to protect against. Among the Watchers, there arose one whose voice carried more weight than the others, not because he was louder, but because he possessed something far more influential, a commanding presence, a natural authority, and a kind of spiritual charisma that drew others into his orbit. His name was Semyaza, and it is he who stands at the center of the Watchers' fall. Not merely as a participant, but as the architect of their rebellion. It was Semyaza who conceived the path they would take, and it was Semyaza who bore the weight of persuading others to follow him into what they all knew would be defiance against the Most High. It is important to understand that the Watchers were not coerced or deceived. They were not ignorant of the law they were about to break, nor were they unaware of the consequences that could follow. These were celestial beings who had stood in the courts of heaven, who had seen the majesty of the Creator, who had once trembled in awe at His glory. And yet, despite all of this, they were swayed, not by a foreign enemy or an overwhelming force, but by a single voice that spoke with the seductive confidence of conviction. Semyaza was not only a leader by title, but by influence. His words ignited what lay dormant in the hearts of the watchers, and his leadership became the flame that kindled their mutual dissent. He did not command with threats, but with persuasion, and therein lies the terrifying reality of his power. He gave voice to the desires that the others had not yet dared to name aloud. He gave form to the temptations that had been growing silently within them. And most critically, he offered a solution to their shared fear, the fear of standing alone in rebellion. When Semyaza spoke of taking wives from among the daughters of men, it was not simply a suggestion born of lust. It was a strategic act of solidarity. He understood that no one would dare to fall alone, that the shame of solitary disobedience would outweigh any momentary satisfaction. So he made them a promise. If they would join him in this transgression, they would do so together. No one would be abandoned, no one left to bear the burden of guilt and isolation. The pact was not only about desire, but about binding one another in mutual ruin. Their gathering on Mount Hermon was the moment that sealed their fate. It was not a casual conversation, nor a fleeting temptation. It was a deliberate, calculated choice. There, they swore an oath, each one committing to take for themselves human wives, and to go through with the unthinkable. The pact they made was dark, not only because of what it entailed, but because of the unity it forged. Their strength no longer came from obedience, but from shared defiance. The holy covenant they had once honored with heaven was exchanged for a new covenant, one that bound them not in righteousness, but in rebellion. In that moment, Semyaza stood as both leader and prisoner of his own influence. According to tradition, he expressed hesitation, not because he had second thoughts about their actions, but because he feared that if the others faltered, he would be the only one to bear the consequences. And this fear is telling. It reveals the dual edge of leadership, especially when it is used to lead others astray. To lead is to carry others with you, but when the path is dark, the fall becomes greater, not just in distance, but in weight. The story of Semyaza is not only a tale of rebellion, but a reflection on the burden of influence. When charisma is used to justify wrongdoing, it becomes more dangerous than force. When conviction is wielded without wisdom, it ceases to be a gift and becomes a curse. The other watchers followed not because they lacked knowledge, but because they lacked resistance. They were persuaded, emboldened, and united by the presence of a leader who cloaked sin in the garments of unity and resolution. It is a chilling reminder that not all who speak with power speak with truth, not all who lead do so toward light, and not all agreements are holy, even when they are made in unison. Semyaza's pact was a declaration of war, not against humanity, but against the divine order itself. And from that pact flowed consequences that would stretch across the ages. The moment the watchers crossed the boundary from observation to action marked a rupture in the harmony of creation. No longer content with watching, they descended further, not only in physical presence, but in spiritual alignment. The decision they made upon Mount Hermon was not left in the realm of words and oaths. It manifested in an act that had never before occurred in the annals of the cosmos, a union between the heavenly and the earthly, between beings of pure spirit and women formed of dust. It was not simply a meeting of two different natures, but a violation of divine order that had been set from the beginning. This union was not born of love in its truest form. It was driven by desire, by a longing that had become distorted, inflamed by pride, and justified by shared rebellion. What these angels felt was not the covenantal love that binds and builds, but a possessive craving that seeks to take rather than to give. They saw the beauty of the daughters of men and chose to act, knowing full well that such relationships were not theirs to claim. In this, they placed their longing above their purpose, and their will above the will of the one who had sent them. The women, drawn to the radiance and mystery of these celestial visitors, were not prepared for what followed. There is no indication that they understood the magnitude of the choice they were making. To them, these beings may have seemed godlike, protectors, or divine messengers cloaked in splendor. But the truth was more complex and more tragic. What appeared as intimacy was actually the beginning of great sorrow. The union was not merely physical, it was spiritual. And in binding themselves to the Watchers, these women were pulled into a cosmic rift, one that would bring both pain and judgment. From these unions came consequences that extended far beyond the individual. It is written in Genesis 6 verse 2, that the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves, whomever they chose. The language here is deliberate. It does not speak of mutual devotion, but of selection and possession. These women were chosen, not in holiness, but in indulgence. And what came forth from these unnatural bonds was not peace, but devastation. The offspring produced from these unions were not ordinary. They were beings of both flesh and corrupted divinity, and their very existence disrupted the balance of the earth. But even before considering their children, one must understand the immediate spiritual cost. The heavens, once a place of perfect order, now bore the stain of betrayal. The earth, once shielded by divine guardianship, now groaned under the weight of an intrusion that shattered the boundary between realms. This act of union stands as one of the most severe transgressions recorded in sacred tradition. Not because of mere physicality, but because of what it represented, a total inversion of the roles assigned by the Creator. Angels, created to serve, made themselves masters. Humans, created to flourish under divine guidance, were drawn into the fallout of celestial rebellion. What had been separate by design was forcibly merged, not to create beauty, but to satisfy lust. And in that moment, the Watchers ceased to be watchers. They became participants in sin, sowers of destruction, and violators of the order they were entrusted to protect. It is crucial to understand that love, in its purest form, honors boundaries and seeks the good of the other. But the love that the Watchers claimed was not love at all. It was a twisted version, corrupted by pride and fueled by an unwillingness to accept the limits placed upon them. They wanted what they could not have. And instead of turning away, they reached for it, not realizing that in doing so, they were pulling themselves and others into an abyss from which there would be no return. The spiritual realm responded not with silence, but with sorrow. The harmony between heaven and earth had been disrupted. The very fabric of the created order had been torn. What had once been guarded by divine law was now exposed to the consequences of unrestrained will. And though the Watchers had convinced themselves that unity would protect them, what followed was judgment that none of them could have foreseen in full. What emerged from the union between the Watchers and the daughters of men was not merely an unusual progeny, but a race that would come to embody the very corruption that their fathers had introduced into the world. The Nephilim, as they are called in Genesis 6 verse 4, were giants not only in stature, but in influence and in the scale of their disruption. They were the tangible consequence of a spiritual crime, the living embodiment of rebellion clothed in flesh. These beings stood outside the natural order of both heaven and earth, and their very existence became a wound in creation, one that festered and spread with time. The ancient texts describe the Nephilim in terms that suggest overwhelming presence. They were not just larger than men, but overpowering in ways that defied explanation. Their strength was unmatched, their intellect corrupted by their divine ancestry, and their ambition unchecked by any fear of God or respect for human life. They ruled through might, not justice. They devoured not only food, but the peace and dignity of those around them. Their hunger was legendary, and many traditions suggest that when the earth could no longer satisfy their appetite, they turned to more terrible means, preying on both animals and people, consuming what was never meant to be taken. Violence followed in their footsteps. Where the Nephilim walked, destruction became the norm. Cities fell into their grip. Kings bowed not out of reverence, but out of terror. Entire communities were enslaved, not by reasoned conquest, but by brute domination. These giants did not build civilizations. They tore them apart, replacing order with chaos, wisdom with cruelty, and cooperation with fear. Their reign was not measured in years, but in the blood that stained the soil beneath them. Spiritually, their presence was even more devastating. Being born of celestial fathers and human mothers, the Nephilim occupied a space that should never have existed. They were hybrids of realms that were meant to remain separate, and their very nature defied the divine blueprint. This alone made them agents of disorder, but it was their disposition, their utter disregard for holiness and reverence, that magnified the tragedy of their existence. They were not neutral beings caught between two worlds. They were the fruit of willful defiance, and they bore the mark of rebellion in everything they did. The fear that spread across the earth was not exaggerated. People did not merely cower at their size, but at their presence. The land cried out beneath them, and the skies grew heavy with the weight of the suffering they inflicted. What began as an act of forbidden desire had now become a global crisis. The Nephilim were not a localized phenomenon. They spread, multiplied, and entrenched themselves across regions, becoming a plague that defied resistance. They corrupted not only individuals, but cultures. They introduced practices that were foreign to righteousness, normalizing evil and celebrating strength over compassion, domination over justice. The ancient world, under the weight of their influence, began to shift. The values that once reflected divine wisdom began to erode. Truth was silenced by terror. Mercy was crushed under the heel of might. The very air grew thick with spiritual pollution, as the legacy of the Watchers reached its peak through the actions of their children. And through it all, heaven watched, not unaware, but patient, waiting for the moment when judgment could no longer be delayed. In Psalm 11 verse 5, it is written that the Lord examines the righteous, but the wicked and those who love violence, his soul hates. That hatred is not the wrath of pettiness, but the fire of holiness in response to relentless corruption. And the Nephilim had become the epitome of that corruption. Their existence mocked the holiness of God. Their actions desecrated the lives they touched, and their influence spread like a shadow across the land. It is in this context that divine action becomes inevitable, not as a reaction born of anger alone, but as a necessary step to preserve the very possibility of goodness on the earth. The rise of the Nephilim was not just a consequence of disobedience, but a warning of what happens when spiritual boundaries are shattered and the unnatural is permitted to flourish unchecked. Their story stands as a chilling reminder that rebellion, once seated, grows roots far deeper than any one generation. It spreads, infects, and demands a reckoning. Into a world burdened by chaos, where the cries of the oppressed were swallowed by the roar of giants and the silence of corrupted angels, there arose a voice unlike any other. This voice did not come from within the corrupted ranks of the Watchers, nor from the terrified remnants of humanity. It came from one chosen, a man set apart, whose life would become the bridge between heaven's justice and earth's despair. His name was Enoch, and he was not a warrior, not a king, but a prophet. A man who walked with God in a time when most fled from his presence. In an age of increasing wickedness, Enoch stood as a beacon of purity and obedience, and it was to him that the divine entrusted a message that would pierce through the veil of rebellion. The ancient writings describe Enoch not merely as a prophet, but as a man who moved between realms, whose visions were not hallucinations, but revelations. He saw not with the eyes of flesh, but with a sight opened by the Spirit, beholding things that were hidden from the eyes of others. His message was not his own invention. It was given to him from the Most High, a declaration born of divine sorrow and impending judgment. It was Enoch who first stood before the Watchers, not to offer comfort, but to deliver a warning, a message that their actions had not gone unnoticed, that the silence of heaven was not ignorance, but patience. When Enoch approached the Watchers, they had already begun to witness the early signs of divine displeasure. The earth, though still fertile, was beginning to groan. Signs and omens, dismissed by the arrogant, were unmistakable to those who still feared God. The Watchers, once fearless in their rebellion, began to waver under the weight of what they had unleashed. And it was in this state of uncertainty that Enoch appeared, not with sword or army, but with a word from the throne of heaven. His message was terrifying in its clarity. The watchers would not escape judgment. Their deeds were recorded, their oaths witnessed, and their offspring condemned. They had forfeited their place in heaven, and no intercession, no appeal, could reverse the decree that had now been spoken. Enoch did not merely speak of consequences. He embodied them. He stood as the living testimony that God had not forgotten the earth, that the cries of the afflicted had reached his ears, and that divine justice, though delayed, was imminent. What makes Enoch's role so powerful is the position he occupied, not only as messenger, but as intercessor. The Book of Enoch describes how, upon hearing the sentence that awaited them, the watchers begged Enoch to plead with God on their behalf. They who once held the position of intercessors for mankind now found themselves in need of mercy, turning to a mortal man to speak on their behalf. And Enoch, obedient even in this, brought their request before God. He entered into the presence of the Almighty, not to bargain, but to submit their plea with trembling reverence. But the answer he received was final. Their judgment was sealed. There would be no pardon, no delay, no redemption for what had been done. The gravity of their transgression had not merely violated a rule, it had broken the order of heaven and desecrated the earth. Enoch was told to return and deliver the verdict to inform the watchers that they would be bound in darkness until the end of days, that their offspring would be destroyed, and that their names would be spoken with dread for generations to come. Enoch's voice was a storm in a time of stillness. It did not whisper. It thundered. His presence among the watchers was a reminder that God sees, that he speaks, and that he will act. The divine silence that had followed their rebellion was not indifference, but the gathering of judgment. The cry of heaven had begun, and Enoch was the first echo of what would soon unfold in full. There is a sacred weight in the role Enoch played. He was not merely delivering a sentence. He was standing in the place between two worlds, carrying the burden of a message that neither side wished to hear. To the watchers, he brought doom. To the righteous, he brought vindication. And in doing so, he revealed that justice and mercy are not opposing forces, but twin pillars of God's governance. His presence assures us that even in the darkest moments of history, when evil seems to reign unchallenged, there's always a voice that will rise, a servant who will speak, and a justice that will not be silenced. The day of reckoning arrived not with chaos, but with the sobering finality of divine decree. There were no more chances, no room left for negotiation or repentance. The watchers, who had once soared through the heavens in radiant purpose, found themselves face to face with the unyielding justice of the very throne they had abandoned. The sentence, delivered through Enoch, was not a threat to frighten them into obedience, but an irrevocable judgment, cold, firm, and final. They had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed, and now the weight of their rebellion was upon them in full. Their punishment was as extraordinary as their crime. These were not beings whose sins could be addressed with temporal consequences. They had tampered with the foundation of creation, introduced a corruption that extended into both physical and spiritual realms, and left behind a legacy of violence and chaos. Their fall was not a stumble, it was a willful leap into darkness. And so their judgment matched the depth of their descent. They were cast out from the presence of God, no longer welcomed in the councils of heaven, stripped of the authority they once held, and bound in chains forged not of iron, but of spiritual confinement. According to the ancient texts, these watchers were imprisoned in the deepest parts of the earth, a place described as utter gloom and desolation. This was not death nor annihilation, but a conscious captivity, where they would remain until the final judgment, when all things would be brought to account. The chains they bore were a symbol not only of restraint, but of disgrace. The ones who had once watched over mankind now sat beneath the earth, cut off from both heaven and humanity, silenced by the verdict of a God who had tolerated their defiance long enough. This judgment serves as a stark reminder that rebellion against divine order is not a light matter. It is not simply the violation of a rule, but the rejection of the source of life itself. The Watchers had chosen to act as if they could rewrite the roles assigned to them, to reach beyond the boundaries established by the Creator. And in doing so, they had touched the sacred with defiled hands. Their actions were not merely immoral. They were a desecration of what was holy. And such desecration demands justice that is both severe and eternal. The silence that followed their imprisonment is telling. There were no songs, no pleas, no protests. The cosmos itself seemed to hold its breath, as if recognizing the seriousness of what had just occurred. The fallen angels, once beings of light, now became examples of divine wrath, not because God delights in punishment, but because holiness cannot overlook defilement. His justice is not like the judgment of men, which is often swayed by emotion or limited by understanding. His justice is perfect, measured, and unwavering, and it reaches even those who once stood closest to his glory. Psalm 9 verse 7 declares that the Lord reigns forever and has established his throne for judgment. The fate of the Watchers affirms this truth. It shows that no being, no matter how exalted, is beyond the reach of accountability. It also illustrates that the higher the position, the greater the fall when one betrays the trust that comes with it. The Watchers had been entrusted with sacred oversight, and in forsaking that charge, they not only condemned themselves, but unleashed suffering upon generations yet to be born. Their judgment, while terrifying, is also instructive. It reveals the integrity of divine justice, the seriousness with which God views spiritual authority, and the inescapable consequences of prideful disobedience. These beings were not tempted by ignorance or weakness, but chose rebellion with full awareness of its cost. And yet, they proceeded, believing that perhaps the consequences would never come, or that their power could shield them from accountability. They were wrong. Their story stands not as a mere cautionary tale, but as a solemn warning. Rebellion may be enticing, and power may seem to grant immunity, but in the end, there is no hiding from the gaze of the eternal judge. The chains that now bind the Watchers are not only a symbol of their downfall, but a declaration to all creation that no transgression is hidden, and no crime against heaven will go unanswered. When the flood came, it was not merely a judgment upon flesh and blood. It was a cleansing of a deeper defilement that had rooted itself into the core of creation. The waters did not simply drown bodies. They sought to wash away a spiritual corruption that had spread unchecked through the offspring of the Watchers. The Nephilim, those unnatural giants who had risen to dominate, fell not by the hand of man, but under the weight of divine decree. Their physical forms perished in the deluge, but their legacy did not vanish with them. For what had been born of both heaven and earth could not be undone so easily. The question that lingers in the silence after the flood is not only where the Nephilim went, but what became of their essence. These were not ordinary beings, and their spirits did not return to the dust as with ordinary men. The ancient traditions and texts, such as the Book of Enoch, suggest a disturbing truth, that the spirits of these giants, stripped of their bodies, remained earthbound. No longer anchored to flesh, they became disembodied presences, malevolent, restless, and deeply embittered. These were not merely echoes or memories of the past. They became active forces, now known by another name, demons. These spirits, born of rebellion and destruction, could not ascend to the heavens, for they were not pure in origin. Nor could they find rest in the earth, for their birth was a violation. They became the unseen tormentors, moving among the living, seeking influence, craving embodiment, and thirsting for the chaos that once surrounded them. The world, though cleansed by water, still bore the scars of their existence. And in those scars, the disembodied spirits found their domain. This understanding reframes much of what is seen in the spiritual warfare, described throughout Scripture and echoed in human experience. Demons are not merely fallen angels. They are the spirits of the Nephilim, born of a forbidden union, carrying within them the memory and malice of a time when divine order was shattered. Their hatred is not abstract, it is personal. They remember the flood, the judgment, the destruction of their kind. And their rage is directed not only at heaven, but at mankind, whom they see as both the cause of their existence and the reason for their doom. Their influence is subtle, but pervasive. They do not build cities as their ancestors did, but they whisper into the hearts of rulers and stir unrest among nations. They do not take wives or produce offspring, but they sow division, confusion, and rebellion wherever they are permitted to remain. These spirits thrive in chaos and draw strength from deception. Their aim is not mere mischief, but spiritual ruin. They tempt, they distort, they accuse, always working in the shadows, always echoing the rebellion of their origin. Throughout history, their presence has been felt, sometimes acknowledged openly in ancient civilizations, other times hidden beneath modern skepticism. But the fruit of their influence remains consistent. Where there is relentless violence, where truth is twisted until it resembles a lie, where innocence is defiled and order is mocked, there lies the evidence of their continued existence. The world, though no longer ruled by giants, still contends with their legacy. In Ephesians 6 verse 12, it is written that our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against rulers, against authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. These forces are not metaphor, they are ancient. They remember the flood, they recall the chains of the watchers, and they carry within them hatred that burns across the centuries. Yet, understanding their origin also brings clarity to their limits. These spirits are not gods. They are not omnipotent. They are bound by the laws of the one who reigns supreme. They require permission to act, and they tremble at the name they cannot overcome. Their power lies in secrecy and seduction, in convincing the world that they are either myth or unconquerable. But the truth is that they are neither. They are real, but they are defeated. Their influence is fierce, but not final. Their continued presence in the world ties the ancient fall of the Watchers directly to the spiritual battles faced today. It is not a closed chapter. It is a continuum, a ripple that began with Forbidden's desire and now churns beneath the surface of human history. Their war is not only against holiness, but against hope. Yet every act of righteousness, every choice to resist temptation, every prayer spoken in truth, pushes back against their domain. From the earliest chapters of sacred history, one theme rises like a thread woven through every story of fall and redemption: the profound and perilous power of desire. It was desire that moved Eve to reach for the fruit in Eden, not out of necessity, but out of the hope of gaining something more. It was desire that turned the eyes of the Watchers from heaven to earth, drawing them toward what they were never meant to possess. Desire itself is not evil. It is part of the design, the spark that moves one to love, to seek, to grow. But when desire loses its anchor in truth and becomes untethered from the Creator's boundaries, it transforms into something dangerous. It becomes the breeding ground for deception, where truth is distorted to fit the will, and boundaries are dismissed as obstacles rather than protection. This is precisely what happened in Eden. The serpent did not force Eve's hand. He simply redirected her desire. He took what was good, a longing for wisdom, and twisted it by offering a counterfeit version, one that could be seized instead of received, taken instead of trusted. The Watchers followed the same path, though their fall came from a higher place. They were not driven by hunger or fear, but by attraction and pride. They desired the beauty of the daughters of men, but instead of seeking understanding or restraint, they allowed that desire to become obsession. And once obsession took root, deception found fertile ground. They deceived themselves into believing that unity in rebellion would somehow protect them from judgment. They convinced each other that desire could be sanctified by solidarity, and in doing so, They ignored the voice of the one who had created both them and the ones they coveted. The heart, both angelic and human, is not immune to deception. In Jeremiah 17 verse 9, it is written that the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. This is not a condemnation without hope, but a warning that reveals the necessity of constant vigilance. The same desire that compels someone to seek God can, if twisted, drive them away from Him. The same longing that leads one to love can also lure them into ruin, if that love is not rooted in righteousness. What makes the fall of the Watchers so compelling and so disturbing is that they were not evil in origin. They were wholly radiant and appointed for a divine purpose. They did not begin with rebellion in their hearts, but with a sacred assignment. Their fall was not instantaneous, but gradual. It began with a glance, then a thought, then a conversation, then an agreement. Every step deeper into rebellion was built on the foundation of a desire that had lost its direction. The same pattern holds true for humanity. Rarely does one leap into destruction in a single moment. It is almost always a slow erosion, small compromises, subtle shifts in perspective, the silencing of conscience for the sake of convenience. The temptation to justify, to rationalize, to tell oneself that what is forbidden is somehow deserved, lies at the core of every great fall. The Watchers fell not because they hated God, but because they stopped fearing Him. They did not curse His name, but they ignored His boundaries. And so the call remains, to examine the heart, not with pride, but with humility. To look within and ask, where have I allowed desire to dictate truth? Where have I exchanged obedience for indulgence? Where have I trusted the whispers of the flesh more than the voice of the Spirit? These are not questions meant to provoke guilt, but to cultivate awareness. For the battle between light and darkness does not only rage in distant realms or ancient times, it unfolds daily in the quiet corners of the soul. Spiritual compromise is rarely loud. It begins in the silence, in the justifications whispered beneath breath, in the allowances made when no one is watching. And yet, it has the power to reshape destiny. The Watchers did not merely change their own fate, they altered the world through one shared decision. And if those so close to heaven could fall, then how much more must humanity cling to grace, to truth, to the disciplines that guard the heart? The stories of Eden and of the Watchers are not separate warnings, they are reflections of one another. One in a garden, the other from the sky, but both driven by desire turned inward instead of upward. And both reveal the devastating cost of letting that desire reign without correction. In every generation, the choice remains the same, to listen to the voice of God or to follow the longing that pleads for satisfaction without sanctity. In the echo of rebellion and the shadows of judgment, a final truth rises, not of despair, but of a path still open. Though the Watchers fell and the Nephilim perished, though the ancient world was scarred by the weight of sin and spiritual violence, the story does not end in ruin. Instead, it points to a deeper message, one that calls not only from the past but reaches into the present, a divine summons to righteousness. The fall of these once glorious beings was not preserved in sacred memory to stir fear alone, but to awaken understanding, to draw a line between what was and what must be. Their failure is a reflection of what happens when purpose is abandoned for passion, when duty is traded for desire. Yet in their judgment lies a lesson, and in that lesson, a call to those who still have the breath to choose. Righteousness is not perfection. It is not the absence of desire, but the mastery of it. It is the alignment of the heart with the voice of the Creator, the refusal to be led by passing impulse when eternal truth stands waiting. God has not hidden His standards, nor has He withheld His Spirit. What the Watchers once rejected is now offered freely to all who would walk in humility and truth. The path is not without cost, but it is not without help. The same God who judged the Watchers also sent prophets, offered covenants, and made a way through which redemption could be known. To walk in righteousness today is to walk in awareness, to live with eyes open to the unseen war that continues. The spirits that still roam have not ceased their efforts. They whisper into thoughts, sow seeds of doubt, tempt the heart to settle for less than what is holy. But the one who walks in righteousness is not alone. There is strength given to those who ask, wisdom for those who seek, and light for those who choose not to hide in the shadows. The Watchers chose to step out of the order given to them, and in doing so, lost their place in the divine structure. Their story serves as a reminder that calling is sacred, and that compromise with darkness always brings consequence. Yet the grace available to humanity is deeper than the rebellion that threatened it. The flood came, but it was not the end. Judgment fell, but so did mercy. And from the wreckage of rebellion rose the promise of restoration. Psalm 34, verse 15 declares that the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and his ears are attentive to their cry. This promise is not made to angels or divine messengers, but to mankind. The same humanity that was once victim to celestial defilement is now the object of divine affection and care. This alone should stir the heart toward faithfulness, toward a commitment not born of fear, but of reverence and love. To choose righteousness is not to follow a path free of struggle, but to take the side of heaven in the great spiritual conflict that began long ago and continues still. It is to say, I will not be ruled by what is easy, but by what is true. I will not be lured by momentary pleasure if it leads me from eternal peace. I will guard my heart, not because I fear judgment, but because I treasure the presence of the one who gives life. The Watchers stand as monuments to what could have been. Their fall was not necessary, it was chosen. And in that choice lies the weight of responsibility. But humanity, through grace, is offered a different end. The judgment that bound them does not have to bind us. The spirits that roam do not have to rule. And the story that began in rebellion can still end in redemption, if the heart chooses rightly. Thank you for joining this deep and sacred exploration into the truth about the Watchers and the angels who fell for women. If this message has stirred your heart, helped you see the spiritual battle in a new light, or simply inspired deeper reflection, please consider subscribing to the channel. Your support helps these powerful messages reach more hearts around the world. Don't forget to like the video if it resonated with you, and leave a comment below. We would love to hear your thoughts and reflections. What stood out to you? What questions do you have? Your voice matters and contributes to a growing community of faith and understanding. Finally, share this video with someone who might need to hear it. A friend, a family member, a loved one walking through confusion or seeking truth. This message may be exactly what they need today. Stay strong, walk in the light, and never forget that righteousness is still the path that leads to peace.